first round pick.
Now you see now, you done f***ed up, you know that, don't you?
Okay, so let's take a minute and talk about Jalen Hurts.
It's my quarterback.
Jokes aside, though, I don't think that I've rooted harder for a single player, even outside of their team success, since probably the subject of this video. And the reason why is because, much like the subject of this video, Jalen is the definition of an underdog. Well, I mean, admittedly, it is kind of hard to call a former four-star recruit who once led the most powerful prep to pro pipeline program to a national title as a freshman and an underdog. But if you know the story of how Jalen went from just being a high-profile clipboard carrier for Tua to the highest paid player in NFL history for approximately 5 minutes, then you already know what I'm talking about. And see, that's really the kind of backstory that we eat up in this neck of the woods. And no, I'm not going to make a cheesesteak joke, so shut up, Ishkabibbles. See, one thing about Philly and the surrounding area is that it is a region defined by its perpetual inferiority complex driven pugnaciousness. I mean, we did throw batteries at Santa Claus that one time 60 years ago, even though most of our parents weren't even alive to see that. We'll never live it down. But somehow a team whose star player is basically just a 4chan chud with a personal trainer and whose fan base literally stabs people half to death that they don't like is the picture of classy football fandom. Like, jokes aside, really, if it weren't for Dallas, San Fran would be the most insufferable fan base in all of footballdom. Well, they and Deshaun Watson's legal team, but whatever. Dawkins, Foles, B-Hop, a bunch of baseball dudes that I don't know or care enough about to pay attention to a whole 162 game season of niggas scratching their balls and spitting out sunflower seeds for 3 hours. They're practically gods in this neck of the woods. Like, they could stab a nigga to death in the neck and no one would bat an eyelash. If you don't believe me, just ask Marvin Harrison. And this isn't even to mention current players who, if they aren't already there, are knocking on the door. Like, practically the entire Eagles first team O and D, with the exception of the linebackers and the safeties this year. The jury is still kind of out on them. But in all of my years of being a Philly sports fan, so like 23-ish, I can't think of one athlete as beloved by and in the greater Philadelphia metropolitan area as Allen Algernon Iverson. Well, at least by black people. And that's kind of what I want to talk about in this video. How despite he never winning a chip, AI became, in my opinion, the most consequential player of his era by revolting against and ultimately changing the culture of the NBA forever. And perhaps more importantly than that, how AI epitomized the double standard that black and white athletes are still held to by sports media today.
I'm a ball player. I was born to be a ball player. I was born to be a football player. That's why I've been doing like athletics.
All right, so here's your obligatory wiki bio section. Allen Ezell Iverson Ezell was born in Hampton, Virginia, but spent most of his youth in nearby Newport News. Now, I'm going to spare y'all the part while I tell you about how poor, black, and crime-ridden Newport News is. Just know it's called bad news by locals for a reason. Well, anyway, young Allen had a hard time staying away and out of that bad news due to a number of factors. At one point, even failing the 8th grade due to truancy. It was soon after this that Iverson's longtime mentor and de facto father figure, Gary Moore, moved Allen back to Hampton to keep him out of that bad news. It was here that Allen would attend Bethel High School and become a two-sport star at both basketball and football, leading his teams to states in both sports in his junior year and winning Virginia High School Player of the Year in both sports that same year. So yeah, basically what I'm saying is that Allen was one of those kids that not only got all the athleticism, but figured this out early enough to get good enough to clown the rest of us who were just on the team because we weren't going to get any girls otherwise. So Allen was a star in the making is what I'm saying. And according to his own account, was being recruited by schools across the nation, and was that much closer to playing his and his family's way out of the sewage-soaked floorboards he grew up walking on in his childhood home. But then the bowling alley incident happened. Long story short, Allen and a group of friends were out at a bowling alley and allegedly had to be told to simmer down their crude Negroisms a peg or two so that the white patrons could enjoy a quiet evening of family fun. This obviously didn't happen, which resulted in a shouting match between Allen's group of friends and a bunch of white kids there, which eventually led to a brawl breaking out between the two factions. And yeah, this is actually actual footage. Well, despite the white group being much larger than the black one, surprise, surprise, only the black kids were arrested for the incident, while Allen being alleged to have hit a white girl over the head with a chair at one point. Again, actual footage. Well, Iverson was held without bail so he could be tried and convicted as an adult for the felony charge of maiming by a mob, which is an archaic Virginia state statute designed to prosecute lynch mobs, ironically enough. Anyway, Iverson was initially sentenced to 15 freaking years, but wound up having his sentence commuted after 4 months due to a combination of public outcry that culminated in an interview with Tom Brokaw and video evidence revealing that AI had actually left the bowling alley right after the fight started. The case was thrown out and Iverson's record expunged, but during that 4-month sentence, Iverson wound up having to complete his high school career at an at-risk facility instead of Bethel High, where he had made his name, thus leaving him unable to compete in either of the sports, which made him a local star, which any high school recruit will tell you is basically as close to a death sentence for your scholarship opportunities as you're going to get. Well, I mean, aside from a unplanned pregnancy, that is. This on top of that awful ex-con stench left by that totally not racially motivated bid he did, left him with virtually no suitors in the college ranks. Well, all except for one. After receiving a heartfelt letter from Allen's mom, the late legendary coach of the Georgetown Hoyas, John Thompson, took a flyer on the skinny point guard from Newport News. And that being said, Thompson was never afraid to go to bat for his star point guard, with AI telling y'all the smoke crew of how in a game against Big East rival Villanova, coincidentally enough, Thompson, upon seeing a group of knuckle-dragging half-wits in the stands dressed in shackles and orange jumpsuits with anti-Iverson signs, refused to let the team play until the hecklers were kicked out of the building. Still, Iverson was regularly met with jailbird chants throughout his college career. And see, it would be this kind of transparently racist heckling that would dog Iverson even when he entered the league. Because you see, if it's one thing that the average sports spectator cannot tolerate, it's player autonomy. Now, Feek has already done a whole video that I was planning on doing myself before I saw that he stole the idea from me, so I won't dwell. But there is very much a racially charged power trip that middle-aged white men get from watching black boys and young men sacrifice their bodies for their entertainment. This is why every time a high-profile player's contract is set to expire, the topic of team loyalty and the ever-popular hometown discount gets brought up. Like, just look at the discourse that was had about Jalen's contract. Admittedly, the chatter was minimal and mostly relegated to sports talk radio, which is basically just Daily Wire for jocks of yesteryear, to be honest, but there was no shortage of people, even in the mainstream media, at least putting forth the idea of Jalen taking less money than he's worth so that Howie could build a better team around him, which some like those mouth breathers at Whip insisting that he needed to do that. And almost always they would use as support Tom Brady doing exactly that for like a good decade or so. But the part they almost always leave out is that Tom only started doing that after he got his first big money deal, and more importantly, married into wealth much greater than his own. Yeah, it just makes the wound sting that much more, doesn't it? And that's the first little detour I want to take. Whether you think Jalen is a better QB than the likes of Burrow or Allen, and I absolutely refuse to include Justin Herbert in that tier until he manages not to choke away a 28-point lead, Jalen is just as important to his team's success as those two are, no matter what armchair football scouts on Twitter have to say. And I absolutely refuse to stop calling it Twitter until Elon can manage to keep a wife for more than 3 years at a time again. So never. I also refuse to accept the whole running quarterback argument because, again, Josh Allen is right freaking there. And Daniel Jones just got paid like $10 million more per year than he's actually worth by basically just being Jack Harlow to Jalen's Drake. It just feels to me that the vast majority of times when an athlete's bag is getting checked, that athlete is either black or brown. Doesn't matter if they literally do and say all the right things, they're still fighting against this implicit bias held against black folks who overcome the odds stacked against their blackness. There's always a reason we find to knock their game and even character, even if it's an arbitrary one. Like, again, the knock on Lamar was that, well, you just can't win with a running quarterback, even though Cam literally took his team to a Super Bowl and won MVP that year. Even after Lamar put arguments about the actual efficacy of his game to rest, then it became a matter of sustainability. Oh, well, he's just another RG3 or Mike Vick in waiting, they say. And yeah, I will give you that Lamar has missed a ton of games in his career, but I mean, Joe Burrow missed his whole rookie season because of an ACL tear. And understand, this isn't meant to be a knock on Joe Burrow or his game. He's actually one of my favorite players, and he's very quickly becoming one of my favorite white boys, like right behind Paul Wall. But it's just odd to me that Burrow's injury history doesn't get brought up as much as Lamar's, and maybe that's because Burrow's game is not really predicated on running like Lamar's, but still, there's only one player in this discussion whose bag is getting checked, and only one of these players has an MVP. Lamar has the MVP. My point being that black athletes, especially ones with such high profile titles as NFL quarterback, have a higher prescription lens focused on them, especially when they don't fit the mold assigned to them. Yeah, exactly. Again, this is circumstantial, but don't y'all find it kind of weird that Russ, the most media-friendly football player since practically ever, didn't really start getting cooked by the majority of the fan base until after he started dating a much more famous black woman? And I know y'all are expecting a Future joke here, but it's honestly way too easy. I would actually feel pretty bad about it, but not nearly as bad as Future does when he scrolls through Russ's Twitter profile. Like I said, most people outside of the NFC West fan base didn't really give a dog's dick about Russ's diva allegations until like the last few years, even though the Legion of Boom alumni have been blowing the whistle on it since like almost immediately after their last Super Bowl loss. Russ suddenly turning into a pumpkin over the last few seasons has just been fuel onto that fire, if you ask me. Now, I know some of y'all are going to immediately point to Deshaun as a counterpoint, but I mean, it's the Browns, y'all. Which did y'all really expect more from them? Also, if you've watched sports for long enough, then you know that the only thing sports fans hate more than player autonomy is having to endure a decade's worth of losing seasons. What I'm saying is white, black, and everything in between. Your crimes are only as serious as your talent is not. Trust me, the league will basically bend over backwards to keep your dirt covered as long as possible, so long as you make a few all-star teams every now and again. I mean, just ask Karl Malone. Oh, wait, y'all ain't know about that? Exactly. All right, so I can't believe that I'm actually going to go this route and defend fake Wotep, but as much as I've criticized Kyrie for his headassery, including his refusal to be vaccinated, why didn't Carson Wentz, back when he was still a half-decent starting quarterback, get just as much heat from the media for refusing the vaccine and missing time with his team? Better yet, why didn't Aaron A-hole get even more heat for lying to the league about his vaccination status? Again, I can't prove that any of this is racially motivated, so if y'all want to bitch about it in the comments, go ahead, be my guest. But also keep in mind that hit dogs are the ones that usually holler. But it just feels to me like when an athlete of color, especially a black one, decides to exercise autonomy from the fan base, the backlash always feels worse, but nowhere near as bad as this. Okay, so back to basketball. AI was drafted in 96 as part of, in a lot of people's opinion, the greatest draft class of all time, even though, I mean, 03 is sitting right there. My point is, this was the 90s, y'all. And as much as we've come to retroactively, at least, associate that decade with an explosion of interest in contemporary black culture, that was not the case in a lot of households. The sports watching ones, at least. What I'm saying is the big sports leagues were still mostly trying to appeal to a majority white middle-aged male audience, which I know this is going to come as a shock to y'all, weren't really getting down with the hippity hop just yet. That, along with AI's past legal troubles, meant that he faced as steep an uphill climb to superstardom as any high-profile draft pick before him. But perhaps the thing that made his challenge even worse was the Mount Rushmore-sized chip he had on his shoulders since youth. Even without the tattoos and the cornrows, Iverson's attitude was enough to rub a lot of late 90s and early aughts basketball fans the wrong way, because that attitude stood in direct defiance of the power dynamic that draws some folks to pro sports in the first place. The same folks, by the way, who vowed to never watch another NFL game so long as Colin Kaepernick remained employed and still bitch about him today, even though he hasn't taken a snap since like 1868 or something. Again, these are people who see professional athletes less like people than they do property, despite, you know, they having literally no financial stake in these leagues outside of betting. And this is in no small part due to many, and depending on what league we're talking about, most of these athletes being of color. Like, think about it. Why don't you see the same level of they don't deserve it discourse being had about hockey and baseball contracts that is had about NFL and NBA ones? Why do you think NIL was and still is such a big controversy with college football purists, even though the NCAA makes a literal $1 billion plus in revenue every year from mostly black bodies? Well, if you can't figure it out, then you probably find Steve Crowder hilarious. But for the rest of you, let's just move on and pretend like those folks have just, I don't know, like they lost their internet access or clicked off to another video, whatever. Those guys. So even before the do-rags and saggy pants, AI wasn't readily embraced by the league or its old guard because of that chip I mentioned earlier. He was perceived as lacking respect or reverence for the NBA's old guard, including the star of Space Jam himself. Leading up to the 97 All-Star Weekend, AI was frequently singled out by the legends of the game as being selfish, cocky, and symbolic of everything that was wrong with the game. This was due in large part to his style of play, which, according to Jamal Crawford, quote, looked like one of us from the block had made it. And this, folks, is exactly why that hesitation crossover that AI used to put Mike on skates the first time they squared up was all but outlawed in a few years. Now, I am going to keep it a buck with y'all. Looking back at that clip now, that was most definitely a carry according to the textbook definition. But this was also a push-off. And this is a travel. The thing is, though, there is a better chance of Fresh and Fit being remonetized than of the league ever admitting to the latter two. And that's for two reasons. One that's kind of obvious when you think about it, and the one that's so obvious you don't even need to, well, at least if you're black. Okay, so a big reason for the NBA's explosion in global popularity has been because the league is leagues faster than it was in the dead ball era of the first half of AI's prime. Thus why the score of an average NBA game today looks like an all-star game from back when I was a kid. This is due to a few rule changes and also changes in how existing rules are called, like traveling, for example. Which is why a bunch of people, myself included, believe AI might have actually topped out as a top 10 or 15 player all time had he played in the pace and space small ball game of today. Like, if he had taken literally one step back on all of those 20-foot jumpers he would hoist on a nightly basis, we'd be sitting here talking about how brilliant his shot selection was instead of how many chucks he took a night. But again, that was just the game 20 years ago. The other reason is it's the cornrows. Well, not just the cornrows, but the everything, honestly. Then Commissioner David Stern was basically the Ronald Reagan of basketball, down to rigging the system for rich a-holes and all. Anyway, Stern's biggest claim to fame for Gen Zennials like myself is his disdain for all things urban, including the de facto face of the NBA in those awkward post-Mike years before Kobe became Kobe and LeBron was too busy having his first wet dreams. This included AI's exaggerated crossover dribble, which until that point, nobody was really doing, aside from maybe Tim Hardaway. Well, I mean, that is unless you want to count.
Just wave your hands in the air and wave them like you just know.
Okay, so I'm not going to get into a comprehensive history of street ball culture because I'm actually saving that for its own entire video, so stay tuned. But for the purposes of this video, it's best to understand street ball as less than honest-to-God team sport, as it is a form of competitive performance art. So yeah, it's basically the basketball equivalent of pro wrestling is what I'm saying. See, street ball is just as much about getting a dub as it is getting your buckets in as flashy a manner as possible. So, yeah, exactly. This is why for most of its history, street ballers have had a hard time making it to the league. And since the height of the hero ball era of the early and mid-aughts, we've seen little, if any, genuine street ballers break into the analytics-driven 3D and dunk game that is the modern NBA. However, in the late 90s and all throughout the aughts, ISO ball was still very much the name of the game. And this just so happened to be a perfect match for the clear-outs and one-on-one battles that define the street ball game. Thus, many of the stars of the early and mid-aughts like Baron Davis, Steve Francis, and Tracy McGrady, along with a handful of actual street ball legends like Rafer, Skip to My Lou Alston, were able to thrive in this era, basically doing what they did on the playgrounds, just watered down enough to fit the pro game. Again, if I had the time, I would spend more time talking about things like NBA Street and the AND1 mixtape tour, but it suffices to say that street ball in the early 2000s was like skateboard culture in the early 80s and cosplaying black people in the 2020s. What I'm saying is it was everywhere and everybody was doing it. And thus everybody was trying to make a buck off of it, which is how and why we got this disaster. Now I bring all this up because it was largely because of AI that that aesthetic became acceptable, let alone marketable enough for the league to jump 10 toes down into it, to the point that today almost every NBA on TNT ad is just a clip from an old Ankle Breakers DVD. Yeah, I bet y'all forgot about those, didn't you? So because I want to keep this video as concise as possible, which I probably shouldn't have went off on that football rant earlier if I really wanted to do that, I'm just going to say that from 96 to 2000, AI was not only establishing himself as one of the league's best young players, but probably his most controversial, aside from Dennis Rodman, obviously. You see, when AI entered the league, MJ was the elder statesman, and thus all the young people wanted to be like Mike, ill-fitting 3-button suits and all. AI, on the other hand, wanted to be a rapper. Let's keep it a buck, and thus eschewed the baby's first business suit look that almost everybody was rocking in favor of do-rags, fitted caps, and 4X tall tees, along with an array of cornrow styles and of course copious amounts of designer jewelry. All things that echoed the decidedly uncorporate, sponsor-friendly hip-hop aesthetic of the time. Now, it wasn't like Iverson was the first NBA star to make his affinity for hip-hop culture public, but whereas other players may have merely shown a fascination with the culture, AI was knee-deep into not just hip-hop, but gangster rap culture, even recording a full album that was set to release at the turn of the millennium, with the single 40 Bars leading the way. And no, if you've never heard it, please don't bother. Spare yourselves. I promise you, I'm doing you a mitzvah. I mean, content aside, the album, or at least the one single I've heard from it, is exceedingly bad. But it's the content which very much reflected the homophobia and misogyny prevalent in hip-hop during the time that league execs and fans alike got all in a tizzy over, to the point that David Stern threatened to ban Iverson if he did release the album. And I also think it bears mentioning that AI did catch a few charges in 97 over marijuana and gun possession, so it's not like he didn't already have a target on his back. And despite his natural combativeness, Iverson did capitulate. But by this point, the damage was kind of already done. Because you see, Larry Brown, who was hired to coach the Sixers in 97, was brought in to kind of rein in Iverson as both a player and a personality. The Sixers front office believing this is what would unlock his ultra instinct for him. And as you would guess, Brown and Iverson spent the better part of the next 3 or so years bumping heads like a pair of bighorn sheep. One of the main reasons being Iverson's habitual tardiness and sometimes even absences from practice, to which he admitted on several occasions was due to him staying out all night and either clubbing or blowing upwards of $1 million in one night in AC. Anyway, things had gotten so bad between Brown and his star player that Iverson was subject to a number of trade talks, including a 6-team, 24-player cluster fluffle of a deal that would have sent him to the Clippers. Now, you got to understand, getting sent to the Clippers in the early aughts was like getting drafted to the WWECW brand back when that was still a thing. Sorry, I couldn't think of anything more mainstream. Terry Funk and Bray Wyatt just died this past week. Give me a break, guys. I'm mourning. My point is, AI was a phone call away from the second team in LA, and more than likely a career of statistical brilliance relegated to relative obscurity. Matter of fact, that deal would have gone through if it weren't for the other Sixer in that deal, Matt Geiger, having a trade exception in his contract and exercising that exception, keeping both he and the future league MVP in Southeast Pennsylvania, and literally changing the course of Philly sports and NBA history. So long story short, Iverson was essentially scared straight, and after some soul searching by both he and Coach Brown, and also a bit of groveling from Iverson to the front office, if we're going to be honest, the two decided to put aside their differences and give their relationship one more try, just like your parents. But unlike your parents, this reconciliation turned out not to be just a complete waste of everyone's time and energy, as both Iverson and Brown enjoyed the greatest individual seasons of their professional careers, with 2 winning league MVP and Coach of the Year respectively, along with AI being named first team All-NBA and leading the league in scoring for the second of 4 seasons and steals for the first of 3 seasons. And I did want to put that caveat of individual because, I mean, Larry did wind up winning a chip with Detroit in 04, so kind of begs the question, who was really the problem here? Now, just like the bowling alley incident, there have been whole documentaries made about AI's MVP season, so I'm not going to get too much into it, but I do want to highlight a couple of noteworthy points about it. For one, AI became the shortest player in league history to win MVP, and that's with being given a few inches by the league office, because though I haven't myself, everybody I know who has either met or seen AI in person all say that there's absolutely no way that this man is 6 feet tall. 5'10", 5'11", if we're being generous. But even then, he's only like 160 pounds soaking wet with concrete bricks in his draws. What I'm saying is, even by modern small ball standards, AI is a little guy. And you got to remember, the NBA back then was as much the land of giants as mid-80s WWF. Again, deal with the reference. And that's kind of the gift and the curse of AI's style of play and his high usage rate that fuels a lot of the detractors' arguments against him. But again, we're not going to get into analytics or whatever today. This ain't that video. AI, much like Cam Newton, got ran into the absolute ground during his prime years, and a lot of that was because both of their respective coaches didn't really have a choice if they were going to keep their teams competitive. And look, I don't want to get into the whole expendable black body thing because, again, Feek did that video, and also this book exists, and y'all really should go read it, like, jokes aside, and also go watch Unk's video too. Yeah. But there is something to be said about how a lot of black athletes who do rely on their athleticism to succeed wind up paying for it at some, if not several points. And the ones that don't get vilified for it. Case in point, the objectively greatest QB in Eagles history until Jalen wins the chip. And do not at me on that because none of you mofos were around to watch Sonny freaking Jurgensen on the 1960 championship team. Moving on. Now, McNabb is a diva, if we're going to keep it a buck, which is part of why he and T.O. couldn't get along long enough for the two to be the unstoppable force that they had the potential to be. But he wasn't wrong when he said that people expected him to run because he was a black quarterback. Now, people will go back and forth about whether McNabb should have stopped running as early as he did and whether that was the difference between 4 NFC Championship appearances and 4 Super Bowl wins. But that's aside from the point. McNabb made a business decision about how to use his own body, and people reacted to it like he had smashed their wives and she ate the afterwards. And this is exactly why my male to female ratio looks the way that it does. I'm sorry, ladies. I couldn't help myself. Even the NAACP got in on the act at one point, calling Donnie mediocre, which, I mean, is the ultimate irony coming from the NAACP, right? But my point is, McNabb did have a point that no one wanted to hear because he was a ball player, and just a ball player. He didn't get to pick and choose how to use his body because he was getting paid to use it in the first place. Yeah, like, y'all should really go read this book. And if you don't have time to read the book, then just go look up RG3, Dante Culpepper, Cam frickin' Newton, Michael Vick. I mean, the list goes on, does it not? So back to Iverson. According to disgraced former NBA ref Tim Donaghy, he would bet against Sixers games when he knew who would be officiating because he knew how much the refs despised AI for his jaw-jacking and how often they would withhold calls when they knew they could get away with it. Now, again, take this with several grains of salt because, I mean, this is the guy who is practically single-handedly responsible for at least one of both Tim Duncan and Kobe's rings. And despite this, AI is still ranked like 10th all time in free throw attempts. But free throws and ones aside, the whole point of foul calls is to prevent injury and to keep players as healthy as possible. And I mean, no, it's not Cam getting torpedoed by a head-hunting safety or Wentz getting slammed face first into the turf and then forgetting his own middle name. But I remember being a kid watching a Sixers game on TNT, and they showed a graphic of all the injuries Iverson has sustained in that season alone, and the joint looked like an operation board. I kid you not. What I'm saying is the league has always been, shall we say, discriminant in the way and against who it enforces its own rules. Because, I mean,
Michael not happy either. They drive down the side. MJ hit a basket with 4 points. There's a technical on Jordan, and he's out. And Jordan is thrown out of the game.
Yes. The count starts over. He's yelling at Benny, and we might want to take the camera off.
Reggie Jackson is being bottled up. It's a 2-on-1. Drop it to Curry, and he is just crushed out of bounds. And now he's going to get a tee. He wanted to foul there, and it should have been. This is not defense.
My point is that, yeah, AI was kind of a dick to the refs, but so was and is practically every other NBA superstar, especially today in the age of player empowerment. And no, I'm not saying that this gives him a pass for being a dick. I'm just saying if it's good for the goose, then it ought to be good for the other gooses or geese, ducks, whatever. Screw it. Move on, Clarence. AI, I feel like, got singled out because he was exactly the kind of dude that the Zebras didn't want infecting the game and the culture with his crude Negroisms. Speaking of
Underdog, 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 underdog.
Okay, so I have a confession to make. Despite spending my entire life either in Philly, Trenton, or somewhere in between those two cities, AI was never my absolute favorite player during his active years. And yes, I know that that's sacrilege, but shut up and let me explain. AI was always in my top 2 or at least 3, depending on what year we're talking about. But Vince Carter was my fave, at least going back to the 2000 dunk contest. Because, I mean,
Vince Carter with his first stop.
did you not see that? That being said, even as a 9-year-old kid, it was abundantly clear to me how badly the league wanted VC to be its new face. And I mean, you can see why, right? I mean, he's tall, he's handsome, he's light-skinned. I'm surprised Tyler Perry hasn't sent them a script and a bad wig yet. But most importantly, he's as squeaky clean as Matt Walsh's search history is not. Now, juxtapose that with the scowling, tattooed thug we begrudgingly gave the MVP to. Wouldn't you rather cheer for the bald guy who can jump out the building instead? Look, he's a UNC grad, just like Mike. Look, here he is missing practice, but not to go blow millions at a blackjack table, but he's getting his degree. Matter of fact, let's shove that narrative straight down your throats for the duration of this series, because God help us if Allen freaking Iverson manages to make it to the finals. And yeah, I distinctly remember they purposefully setting Iverson up as the villain in this series until AI's play forced you to cheer him on, even if you weren't already on the team, even as he was going blow for blow with VC all the way until that Game 7 brick. Man, double doinks and Philly sports go together like turkey necks and collard greens. If you don't believe me, just ask Feek. I was all in on the Iverson bandwagon, even if only until VC came back the next year. But I remember that whole deal kind of revealing to me how much AI had working against him. And if for no other reason, I wanted to see him win the big one. It was like Austin versus McMahon, but with actual stakes this time. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and skip the Milwaukee series and go straight to the finals, because that's where the legend of the little point guard that could was really made. See, you got to understand, no one, and I mean nobody outside of the greater Philadelphia metro area or whatever, had the Sixers even making this series competitive, let alone winning it. Like, this Lakers team was the definition of historic. This was Shaq at the height of his powers and Kobe just beginning to figure his out. The Lakers were a buzzsaw out west and hadn't lost a game since the regular season. And why would that be any different against whoever the decidedly inferior Eastern Conference sent to the chip?
4 and 5. Must shoot the ball. Kobe Bryant lost it. Here's Iverson. It's a sloppy start.
I mean, Kobe Bryant right on it. He drives it and gets Kobe back on his heels, pulls back with the quick release, continues to put the pressure on the defense.
It's not going anywhere.
The pressure defense is really bothering the Lakers.
And here in the first half, just 2 for 9 from the field. Iverson.
Yeah, well, evidently nobody told the Sixers that they were supposed to just roll over and die, except, of course, the national media. But, I mean, screw them. Nobody likes us and we don't care, remember? As objectively inferior as this Sixers team was, they managed to take the unstoppable force that was the 2000-2001 Lakers to the limit in Game 1, ultimately forcing overtime, which is when this happened.
99 lead. Iverson. Bothered by Lou. Iverson.
How about that?
And steps over Tyronn Lue.
Like, jokes aside, there is really no way for me to articulate how historic this moment is. Like, I literally have it embroidered on my shirt. Like, I promise you, everybody where I lived was convinced that we were going to win the chip after this game. Okay, well, yeah, maybe we did count our chickens a little early, but that was the definition of a moral victory. Remember, Philly was never supposed to even get here in the first place. Like, niggas from around my way were unironically rocking Aaron McKee jerseys that year. And again, you're forgiven if you don't know who that is. We'll just want. So what I'm saying is that run was special, even if not successful, just for how improbable it was. And maybe that 0-1 team wasn't as bad as I made it out to be, or most of us remember it to be, but I mean, it wasn't good enough to stop the opposing team from doubling AI on basically every possession, which, you know, would kind of make your efficiency take a hit. And yeah, Iverson would go on to make a few more All-NBA teams and won another 2 scoring and steals titles, as well as a butt ton of all-star appearances. But this would be the height of AI and Brown's combined success together, as Brown, finally having become fed up with AI's antics, wound up leaving the team after the 0-3 season. The Sixers did return to the playoffs in both the 0-1 and 0-2 seasons, but got bounced in the first round of the latter in 5 games by the then underdog Celtics. Now, I know it may sound like I'm making it seem as though the media had it out for AI, but that's because they did. Like, I'm not joking about that. Remember, at this time, sports journalism was as much an old boys club as the league itself. And this defiant, disrespectful ne'er-do-well was not the guy that they or the owners thought should be the face of basketball. Thus, the practice thing constantly being brought up. Like, every Q&A session was almost like a roll call or something. Coach Brown was constantly being hounded with questions about AI's practice habits, and on several occasions just straight up said that Allen was a grown man and he could not control the man's tardiness, even if it did frustrate him beyond belief. Well, after that Game 5 loss, Brown was asked the practice question again, and to explain Allen's tardiness, to which Brown said he didn't know why Allen was late and that he just assumed that he was hungover. Now, agree or disagree on whether that comment was out of pocket, but either way, just like clockwork, the media, being the media, asked Iverson to comment on Brown's comments from earlier. And, well,
what are we talking about? Practice? We're talking about practice, man. We're talking about practice.
Okay, so even if you've never watched a game of basketball aside from a 2K streamer, I bet you know this clip. I mean, it was memed to death before memes were even a thing. But just like with memes, the context of this quote often gets lost in the humor of it.
I'm upset. I'm upset for one reason, man. Because I'm in here. I lost. I lost my best friend. I lost him, and I lost this year. Everything's going downhill for me, far as just that, you know, far as my life. And then I'm dealing with this right here. I don't want to deal with this, man. I don't want to go through this shit.
2 seasons removed from that magical finals run, AI was once again subject to trade rumors stemming from, who could have guessed it, his practice habits and just general bad blood between he and his head coach. However, a much more important incident occurred that really served as the straw that broke the camel's back. On October 14, 2001, Iverson's childhood friend, Rashawn Langford, was shot and killed outside an apartment complex in Hampton. In fact, AI had been wearing black armbands with the letters RA for the duration of that season in honor of Langford. This on top of the years of racially charged verbal abuse from fans, criticism by the media, and the league's open campaign to relegate him to B+ player status finally boiled over into this rant. And look, I know this video comes off as Iverson apologetics, and I'm not going to lie, it kind of is. But let's set the record straight here. I'm not completely absolving Iverson of any of his culpability. Like he said himself, he was a, quote, certified ass to Coach Brown during the latter's tenure with the Sixers. And I mean, listen, as big a supporter for player autonomy as I am, when you're getting paid millions of dollars a year to play a kid's game 82 times in that year, I mean, the least you can do is show up to practice, right? That being said, the media did have it out for Iverson. That much was evident. Case in point, they running with that bogus narrative about him throwing his naked wife out of the house during an argument, and the local police department's subsequent admission of their overzealous pursuit to charge Iverson due to his high profile. But anyway, Iverson, even after the Larry Brown years, was still an all-NBA caliber talent, even if he couldn't quite get to the promised land by himself at this point. And wouldn't you know it, he finally got some halfway decent second help in Andre Iguodala, even if this Iggy wasn't the Iggy that would win a finals MVP quite yet. But I mean, that's not half bad when you spend the better part of your prime years sharing the floor with people like Larry Hughes, Sam Dalembert, and what was left of Chris Webber after he had sold his skills Monstar style for 2 years with Tyra Banks. And I mean, I get it. I'm not mad. I'm just saying. But then after, surprise, surprise, not getting along with the new coaching staff, AI requested a trade and was shipped out to Denver. And what you know it, had his 2 most efficient scoring seasons as a pro when paired with another superstar caliber player. Matter of fact, in his first season in Denver, not only did the Nuggets make the playoffs, but AI and Melo were number 2 and number 1 in scoring in the league, respectively. But let's back up a bit, because those 2 seasons precede what is probably the defining event of 2000s NBA basketball.
Now Artest has jumped over the scorer's table and is trying to get down to the bench. Artest is in the stands. Oh, this is awful. Fans are getting involved. Steven Jackson's in the fans. Rasheed Wallace going into the stands.
Yeah, so as big of a b-ball head as I was during this time, I didn't actually see this game. But when I got to school the next day, all anyone could talk about was Ron Artest fading a fan for chucking a beer at his head. Which, I mean, Yeah, bet. Nigga was asking for it. Jokes aside, the malice at the palace was exactly the excuse the league needed to crack down on all of the uppity Negroes with their throwback jerseys, Timberland boots, and pants so baggy they could double as a kangaroo pouch. In 2005, the league instituted its now infamous dress code policy, which basically outlawed anything that you wouldn't wear to an interview at a Fortune 500 company or as a youth pastor. Now, if you ask a lot of people, this was basically a roundabout way for the league to send a message to Iverson, who, if you remember, had popularized the hip-hop apparel aesthetic being worn by NBA players then in the first place. Now, believe what you want about that, but what we know for certain is that even if the league's owners weren't targeting Iverson, the league's officials probably were. Going back to that Donaghy story from earlier. But it doesn't really matter because folks, it seems like, have made up their minds, and most definitely did during his prime, about how they feel about Iverson. Despite the success of those 2 seasons, Denver opted not to extend AI and instead shipped him out to Detroit. Now, the question is, a year removed from having another all-NBA caliber season, why would the Nuggets jettison the most talented teammate Melo would have to that point until probably Russell Westbrook like a whole decade later? Well, take this with a grain of salt, but a lot of people believe the Nuggets front office was afraid of the influence that Iverson would have on their budding young superstar and franchise cornerstone. I mean, the media had spent a whole decade telling everyone in their ears how selfish, how bad a teammate, and how much of an unrepentant criminal AI was. So the well was already poisoned, is what I'm saying.
This is what happened when you lose. You know, you go to the finals, and then the next year, you're out in the first round. This is what happened, you know. I get it, you know. Everybody takes shots at Allen Iverson. It's just unfortunate that I can't punch back.
Once you have a rep, it's a bastard to shake you. No amount of stutter steps or crossover dribbles can help you do that. Anyway, Iverson only played like half a season in Detroit due to a combination of injuries and, again, having it out with the staff, before stopping in Memphis for a hot minute and a cup of coffee. And then he was effectively out of the league. That is until the Sixers came calling about the possibility of a homecoming, and as you would imagine, upon returning to the Wells Fargo, or might have still been Wachovia at that point, it doesn't matter. Upon returning to Philadelphia in the hometown jersey, no less, Iverson was greeted with the Philly equivalent of a Roman triumph. Battery-filled snowballs and all. But that reunion would be short-lived, as AI only played like 15 games before requesting to be released in order to spend time with his sick daughter. And if I'm going to put my tinfoil hat on here, he wasn't interested in playing for the then lottery-bound Sixers at that point in his career. And thus, one of the most polarizing and electrifying NBA careers came to a decidedly anticlimactic end. And it's wild because, to look at it now, the NBA makes it seem like after that 01 season, Iverson was the league's favorite underdog, when no, he most definitely wasn't. He was some uppity tattoo gangster rap thug who didn't know his place, and sports media reminded us of this basically until he retired. And that honestly is why people like me, even if he wasn't ever my absolute favorite player, were drawn to AI. Like, when I looked at MJ or Shaq or Kobe or Vince Carter, they were basically superheroes, but AI was just one of my mom's brothers, sitting on the front porch with a blunt in one hand and a Corona in the other. He just so happened to be good at hooping. Like Crawford said it himself, somebody that made it off the block and into the league. And he didn't let getting to the league change him. Rather, he forced the league and his fans to accept that this is who he was, and they were just going to have to deal with it. And in that way, even if not intentionally, he let it be known that it was okay to be yourself, even if yourself is not conventional or popular. But more importantly than that, he challenged and even shattered the mold of what a professional black athlete is supposed to look, sound, and act like. He was brash, combative, and wore his heart on his sleeve at all times. In some ways, you could say he was the Muhammad Ali of his time, sans the daily maths, of course. Don't worry, white people. If you're not a Wu-Tang fan or have lived in any northeastern city in the 2 decades between 1980 and 2000, I don't really expect y'all to get that reference. It's an NOI thing. Moving on. The mainstream did not like him because they could not control him the way they've grown accustomed to controlling black bodies. That is to say, with narratives as opposed to nooses. That is the plight of the black athlete, the challenge of making one's blackness palatable to an audience that is not accustomed to being challenged by that blackness, while also staying true to one's own sense of self. Some successfully walk this tightrope. Hell, most have to in order to keep their jobs. But Iverson just said, F all that noise. Y'all are just going to have to take what I give you. And as a black kid in the late 90s and in the aughts, and even today as a black man, that's empowering. To see another black man absolutely refuse to water himself down to avoid pissing off a bunch of white-haired beat writers and Tony Talks a Lot calling him from Elkins Park. See, black people live in a perpetual state of duality in which we have to be able to switch from one identity to the other at the drop of a dime. And that just becomes more true the closer your blackness is tied to your socioeconomic background. AI didn't do that, though. And that's what I think makes him so important. It's not just for having one of the single greatest guard seasons that I've seen, at least. It's not for having one of the top 30 or 40 NBA careers all time. And more importantly, for having one of the best basketball shoots of all time. And it's not even for largely being responsible for introducing the hip-hop aesthetic that has now pretty much become inextricable from the NBA, even if its authenticity has gone from DMX to Drake over the past 20 years. No, what's more important than all of that is that AI told a generation of hood kids, and just kids in general, that it's okay to be a hood kid, even when everyone else says it's not. I mean, yeah, you can, and I have argued that maybe if he had shown a little more dedication to honing his craft or accepted the fact that he just wasn't that guy anymore at the end of his career, or, you know, maybe did a handful of deadlifts every once in a while, then maybe, I don't know, his numbers would be a little better, or maybe he wouldn't have broken down as fast as he did. Or at least he could have joined more than the sum of its parts super team like Pierce, Garnett, and Allen did. But that's all aside from the point, which is that AI transcended the sport itself to become a pop culture icon for simply refusing to conform. In that way, regardless of his actual rank among the game's greats, Iverson is in a tier of athlete along with Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, the Williams sisters, Arthur Ashe, Tiger Woods even. He was a trendsetter, a trailblazer, a barrier breaker. And in that way, he was, even if not intentionally so, a revolutionary. That last line was way too good to screw up with a joke. That's Pulitzer Prize worthy. Deuces.
Never been seen out, that's where you're wrong. But give the man a taste and he's gone. Nodding off sleep to a jazz tune. I can hear his head banging on the wall in the next room. Get the pillow, hope I don't wake him. For this man a cuss, hear it all in verbatim. Telling me how to raise my boy unless he's taking over. I said, Pop, maybe when you're older. Laughed all night about the hookers at the party. Old man standing yelling, good God Almighty.